Well, welcome everyone. This is Internet 5. We're going to talk about a few things, including social media. What is the difference between a feed that is algorithmic versus chronological? Why is it that social media is so popular? And how did it get here in the first place? So, I'm going to try a little bit of a different format today, and we will just see how this goes. Uh, Play us out, Sting. All right. So, Internet 5, social media. We are going to go over a bunch of different things, including some of the tools that we learned about last time. Now, social media came about at the same time that we had things um, like MySpace are finally starting to wane. So let's take a look at some of those trend lines that were happening. I remember back in 2005 when Facebook came out and I started using it in my college. I think it was the fall of 2005. It might have been later than that. Um, but it was a wild time. It was brand new. Mark Zuckerberg, well, Mark Zuckerberg, he was basically just like a baby at one point creating Facebook. Now he owns this giant company and it has all of these employees and people use things. Now, there's something that you might not know about social media and about the world it is that you live in. Did you know that Facebook is actually part of a company, a larger company that is called Meta? Now, let's write that down. And this Meta is like a big company that has a giant umbrella. And under this umbrella are several other companies that you're probably familiar with. One of them is Instagram. We'll represent that with like a little camera here. One of them is WhatsApp, which we'll represent with a little telephone here, kind of like their icons. And another one is Facebook. They actually have several other companies, and so you think you're dealing with just this company Facebook or just WhatsApp or just Instagram, but you're actually dealing with this much larger thing called Meta. So, um, what does that pathway look like? Well, let's take a look at some of these charts. And one of this great chart making tool is called Google Trends. And so we can actually search across for just the United States. We will select not just the past day, but let's say 2004 to present. And if we chart that time for MySpace, what do we find? We find that MySpace peaked around July 2007. Now, this doesn't give us the actual number of search queries that people are using where they type in MySpace, but it does give you an idea for how prevalent those search terms have changed over time in those volumes. And the great thing about this tool is that you can actually compare the number of times on the internet people are searching for other things. So let's say that we can compare this to Facebook. If we compare this to Facebook, well, this tells us a pretty easy story here, right? And the story is that when I started using Facebook sometime in October of 2006, actually, I think I used it about here. Facebook was actually limited to only college students, but it started growing and growing and growing. And in 2009, when I graduated college, Facebook was already overtaking MySpace. And when it did, MySpace never actually recovered from that. We could add in a couple other things too. These are probably social media sites you're familiar with. One of them is Twitter. Another one might be like Instagram. And let's just see how that looks. So at this point, Facebook is still being searched much more than these other networks, but you might notice that Facebook is starting to trend down over time. People are using it less and less for reasons maybe I'll describe in the next installment of this internet. Now, if you haven't read charts like this before, let's go over real carefully here. On the bottom here, this is the y-axis, rather the x-axis. And on the up to down, this is the y-axis. This shows popularity. So the most popular time for Facebook, let's say it had 93% of the volume of search, and that was in 2010. This is compared to the other items. So now, if I get rid of Twitter, let's get rid of MySpace. We can look at things like, when did TikTok become big? So if I say TikTok, well, it looks like TikTok is becoming big. And if we actually look at just a little bit of a different time, let's say like the past 5 years, well, we'll try that again here. We see that at some points, TikTok is actually searched more than Facebook. Here it has 47 compared to Facebook's 35. So what do we make of this, right? What even is social media, and what tools do we have for understanding it? So let's try to remember some of the tools that we learned about in our last video in part 4. One of the tools that we learned about was third places. And for now, I'm just going to talk about early Facebook, and we'll do a little bit of a timeline together as I reminisce about what has become of social media at this point. I think it's kind of been a little bit negative. So we have third places. These are those positive places like a bowling alley or a church or a library. Some of these areas where you might be able to talk to people who are there on a regular basis. How interesting, right? We also talked about last time, what did we talk about last time? We talked about things like reciprocity and social proof, right? So we'll just say social proof. We talked about some of the proto-social media things. And proto-social media included things like email. It included things like Usenet. It included things like, these earlier things like AOL Instant Messenger. Things where basically you're sending, a one-to-one message where if you have one person over here on this side and another person over here on this side, that was social media. You're talking to each other. Well, in around 2005, Facebook had this idea of the wall. Not the Pink Floyd album, but the idea was that each of these people here, all of your friends, they would all have their own wall. And it worked kind of like MySpace, except you couldn't really have the same amount of control. And you could actually post on other people's wall. So imagine that you just had a wall. Every one of these people, they all had a wall. And if you wanted to, you could write something on your friend's wall. And then another one of their friends might write something on the wall. Another one of their friends might write something on the wall. And this created the first kind of a feed which belonged to somebody. It would belong to somebody, it would end up on their wall, and it came in this format, which was reverse chronological. This is a really crucial point that I'm going to expand on. In the reverse chronological feed, the way that things worked was that you might have an item. So if we have a feed item goes in, this could come from basically one of your friends. Let's say that we have friend A, we have friend B, and then we have friend C, and they post at different times. Well, let's say that friend A posts first, and then friend B, and then friend C. At first, you had just a reverse chronological feed. And if we imagine this as a big list right here, this is a big list that you might scroll down. Well, if friend A posts first, that means they show up right here. And then if friend B posts, you would think it would show up right there. But this is reverse chronological. And because it's reverse chronological, what actually happens is A moves down to here, and B becomes first. And C, if they even post after that, they come up first. This used to be the default view for all of the different social medias, and the algorithm was just based on time. Let's say that post A came Monday, post B came Tuesday, and post C came Wednesday. Well, that's just how it would be. Now, this is an important aspect of how feeds worked back then. We're going to jump ahead just a little bit here and talk about the other kind of feed. This is the kind of feed that is prioritizing something, and we'll talk about that something as well. I'm going to call this kind of a feed, I'm going to call it an AI feed, or AI ordered. Now, in this case, probably you already have lots and lots of posts. And what AI is going to do is it's going to try to predict what you're thinking. It's going to try to understand exactly what you want, maybe the thing that you'll click on, maybe the thing that it wants you to click on. And so let's just say that it shows up as D, and then E, and then A, and then B. And as you scroll down, it just has this giant bucket filled with different posts inside of it. Maybe there's thousands, maybe there's news stories, and it just tries to present these to you as you go along and you consume. So as you scroll down, it tries to learn about what it is that you're looking at and what it can actually feed you. That's why they call it a feed. Another word for a feed would be like a trough. I think we should call it maybe a trough. Okay, so now there's this difference, right? We have that feed, and then we have this reverse chronological feed, and then we were talking, I think, about social media here. So now let's go ahead and discuss some of the ways that Facebook changed over the years. This is basically based on my recollection, so not something that you can exactly know actually happened, but let's try it out anyway. So for this timeline of Facebook, I'm just going to call it FB. Facebook basically has been the largest purveyor of social media, and that's why I'm following them as a timeline. I think it goes all the way from about 2004, let's say, to 2025. And I'm just going to write down some of the things that I find significant and talk about them as time moves on here. So around 2005, 2006, we'll call this 6, maybe 7 or 8. What was Facebook doing at this point? Well, Facebook was only inside of colleges, and this actually gets this actually is a great way to grow the social media. And so right here, we'll say this is college only, and there's some problem that this kind of solved, where Facebook could advertise to individual universities. They started over here with some of the bigger colleges like Stanford, which I think is where Mark Zuckerberg was going at the time. Stanford, Harvard, some of these so-called Ivy League schools. And after that, exclusive limited time offer to only them, they started going to some of the larger colleges. Bigger colleges like the one I went to. And it was so cool because it was like college kids only at the time. And what you could do is, like I said, during that time, you had people. They all had something called a wall. And on that wall, we only dealt with reverse chronological. Now, to get enough people to use this, this overcomes something called the cold start problem. What is the cold start problem? It is basically, how do you get a social media going if you only have a couple of people there? Well, you have to grow it, but you have to grow it based on cities or locations or friend groups, and that's what they solved there. So, we're going to back up a little bit here. So this is the college only days. Now, for a while, that went great. And let's say that we went, I'm just going to kind of mark off some things here. Let's say that this is 2010, 2015, 2020-ish, not drawn to scale. So then we had things like 9, 10, 11, and sometime around 2011, something else gets born. And this was Twitter. And Twitter created the small form messages. So what you actually had was you had things like a cell phone. And that cell phone, if it was a BlackBerry, maybe you had all of the keys for the keyboard. Otherwise, you were dependent on like this T9 system. This is when texting just got popular and people started using texting. So Twitter started out as only having 144 characters. And you could use that. You could use those characters to get into a big stream. At this point, there were many, many millions of people on Facebook, many millions of people on Twitter. And so your chronological feed on Twitter, whereas on Facebook, it only included people who were your friends, who you knew directly, who actually wrote something down on your wall. On Twitter, it would include everybody in the world that you followed. And so you had a huge diversity of things in your feed, posts, pictures, little bits of text. And Twitter also introduced something called the hashtag. Now, this hashtag allowed you to add in things like words that were attached to events that were actually happening. So, for example, you might have a tag of earthquake. And this was like a tremendous thing that was brand new, that nobody had ever thought of before. And it was like, wow, the world is suddenly global. And there are tons and tons of research papers that you can find about this. I'll show an example here. Here's an example here. This is all Google Scholar results, and so hopefully this loads up correctly. So this is an example. This is an academic person writing about Twitter. It looks like this is around 2010, 2009. And they thought, oh my goodness, maybe Twitter can actually improve earthquake responses. This is when people didn't really know what Twitter was exactly. Like, people were slow to actually understand. So they say here, let's see, who is this? I think you saw it in just the screen before here. Twitter is a service that allows anyone to send and receive 140 character tweets. Character, that's kind of like a letter. Text message via an internet-enabled device. Tweets can be sent and received through a web page, mobile device, or third-party Twitter applications. Tweets can also be sent publicly or privately to a specified user. All users who want to follow a Twitter user will receive that user's tweets and messages. And they could, alert you on your phone, stuff like that. The underlying premise is that messages are short status updates of what a user is doing. In general, the messages are declarative and do not beg a reply. You can say something like eating toast or heading out for the party at John's house. And so what these researchers did was they started counting tweets and just seeing how many tweets there are in a particular region. And they discovered here that tweets are binned in 10-second intervals. What does that mean? This is kind of like the Google Trends chart that we were looking at, but instead of counting the number of times people are searching for something, they're looking for tweets that rose above a background level of 1 per hour to about 150 per minute. So lots and lots of tweeting after an earthquake. And so this is just like a super interesting thing that that researchers thought, wow, this is great. Now that we have all of this data, we can use it to analyze stuff. That's just one of many of these examples here. All right, let's hop back in our timeline and see where we are. So, this is around 2010. And, at that time, that's what's going on. Facebook quickly copies this idea of a feed and lets you post status, and it's kind of like a Twitter. So I'm going to call this reverse chronological feed time. And this is wall time. At some point, some of the social media companies realize that this is this global opportunity to collect data, to push messages, to do advertising, and it gets kind of crazy, kind of less fun in a way. But you have other social media things come up, right? Like, when did Instagram become a thing? It looks like it was probably more like maybe like 2015, 2014. Sometime around here, Instagram became popular. And then there's so many different versions of social media, but let's kind of mainly stick to Facebook here, right? We had Facebook feeds. We had, at some point, probably around 2014, 2015, we started to get this problem. And I know right now it's really popular to talk about something like AI slop. But before you had AI slop, you just had too much information, right? So why did you need an algorithm for a feed? Well, too many posts. Too much internet. And so what would happen would be, let's imagine that you're on Facebook and the year is 2000, we'll say it's 2013. You have lots and lots of posts here in reverse chronological order. But guess what? In this post, maybe your friend is getting engaged. So here's the diamond ring, here's the post, and the thing is you might get kind of lazy. You might say, okay, I like this post, I like this post, I like this post, I like this post. But if you stopped here, you wouldn't see this really important post. Now, this could have some pretty important complications. If you're like, if you're friends with this person, they might think, hey, why didn't you comment on my engagement post? And you say, well, I looked through Facebook and I just didn't see it. Why didn't you see it? Well, that's a problem. That's a problem. And the other thing is that sometimes, because of all of these different statuses, a lot of these were boring, right? Made toast. It's not that interesting. So Facebook needed some way to distinguish between what is a good post, what is a mediocre post, what why do I even care, right? So sometime, I don't know when it was, maybe it was around here, they invented an amazing thing. This amazing thing changed the history of social media forever. And you know what it was? Can you guess what it was? It was the like. So you could like something on Facebook. You could do like a little thumb thing, and I'm just not very good at drawing thumbs. There it is. You could like something on Facebook. And by being able to like something on Facebook, that action, recording that action, was transformative. What did that give Facebook? It gave Facebook information. What if this had what if this post got seen by somebody? Well, probably it might have something like 35 likes. But this about making toast, it might only have 3 likes. So this is just one of the things that you might consider in an AI feed ordering. So let's say, consider quality. Consider recency, right? How long ago was this? How much quality does it have? And basically, quality you can measure based on likes. And recency you can measure based on just time. So if this post was made 5 seconds ago, it might pop up to the top. If this post was made 5 days ago, even though it's 5 days old, since it got so many likes, it might pop up into the top. And so there's this problem, there's this issue, there's this thing that it has to consider in order to make sure that you, the customer, the consumer, take your eyeballs and look at that. So let's look back at our timeline here and just appreciate how Facebook created likes. That's really the transformative thing that they made that was different than things that had existed before. And by having those likes, shortly after that, Facebook was able to create these AI feeds, AI orders. Pretty cool, pretty interesting, right? I'm going to take a break for a second and show you something I have. This is a book by Herbert Simon. This is called The Sciences of the Artificial. Herbert Simon worked at the MIT, I think it was the MIT AI lab. And this is one of the big labs that made things happen, like the things that kind of power the feeds that you have and all of that. I did want to talk about a quote that he made, if I can find it. So the quote is that human beings viewed as behaving systems are quite simple. The apparent complexity of our behavior over time is largely a reflection of the complexity of the environment in which we find ourselves. Now, Herbert Simon here, he really likes the idea of very simple things combining together to make things that are apparently complex. That's the whole thesis here. The other book I have that I like by Annette Markham here, this is called Life Online, and it's about researching real experiences in virtual spaces. And I'm going to find something in here to read too. So she writes here, I'm trying to comprehend the connections among texts. Text I have written, text I've encountered, texts I've generated with others online, layer upon layer of dialogue. Within me, the text I bump up against, the others I meet, and the various selves I perform and embody. So the big quote here is the internet is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. That the things that you experience on the internet are basically extremely meaningful and extremely meaningless. And I think it's important to take let's look at some philosophical concepts here for a minute when we're talking about feeds and we're talking about the presentation of self. The first idea I want to talk about is summum bonum. What? This is a Latin phrase, a Latin expression. This basically means the ultimate or the highest good. This is a super common idea in philosophy. And it's about orienting yourself into what's the best thing, what's the highest thing that I can actually take. And it's especially relevant in medieval philosophy. It was started by Cicero. Cicero is like the philosopher's philosopher, at least during the time when he was around. The other concept I want to talk about is called phenomenology. 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 Phenomenology is a kind of philosophy that's like, it's kind of got popular more like in the 1900s. You have people like Martin Heidegger who talk about it. You have people like Bergson who talk about it. And it's kind of like what you feel is kind of real. Right? So it's like, let's stop thinking about things in terms of like Plato would think about it. Plato would think about things like you have a circle somewhere, it's a perfect circle. It's just like an idea in your head. You know, I'll represent that by like a little light bulb. It's an idea in your head. Whereas phenomenology, it kind of goes from the opposite. It says like, hey, you have a bunch of things and those things kind of mean something, but it really kind of depends. And so phenomenology basically is about an experience. And then we also have this idea from different researchers based on presentation, right? Let's go back to our timeline. When we're talking about presentation, sometime when I was in college here, I had a friend, and that friend included a new Facebook profile. And this Facebook profile was actually for a plant. So they had like a little plant, it had these little leaves on it, and kind of like role play as the plant and say, hey, I got water today, I'm doing really good. You might see sometimes, even today, sometimes people might have like like a cat, and their cat might have their own Instagram, right? That's kind of weird. I don't think the cat is using Instagram. I don't think they really care about Instagram likes, but nevertheless, they're kind of presenting as having a cat. And then there's this other problem where it depends on which type of media you're using, how it's appropriate to present yourself, right? Way back in the day here, 2014, 2015, I think this is about the time of Snapchat. And on Snapchat, you could create like a dog filter or a cat filter or whatever, have some fun with it, send it to your friends, but you probably wouldn't use it as a resume on LinkedIn, right? LinkedIn probably goes around here. We'll clean some of that up. So basically, in terms of presenting yourself, what does that look like? Who are you really? Right? Are you the same person that you're presenting yourself online, or is it a little bit different? And there can just be a huge gap between how someone really is and then how they present. I don't think that's wrong, really, but I do think it's something that you need to be aware of when you're looking at things. Like, I'm not really using a YouTube voice right now. If you talk to me in person, I might sound pretty similar to this. But I get it. I get it. Okay. Let's look at our timeline again and talk a little bit more about feeds. So we have this big social media thing. We have this other part, which is a little bit more fishy. Oh yeah, we have this part over here that I would like to forget. 2020-ish, right? We have this whole COVID thing that happened. And so online, you also have things like moderation. All of these systems and even old systems, you have this need to kind of police and to corral communities into being something that's kind of nice, right? Now I just want to talk about this feed, and then I will give some hot takes on all of the social medias after that. Next time we're going to talk about the dangers. So let's get right back into our feeds here. Okay, so now this is where summum bonum comes in. We have these different feeds, and our idea is basically the greatest thing we can do is we can find the things that have the most recentness, and we can find the things that also have the best quality. And that quality, we can find that out based on likes. So if we take this post right here, we can give it a bunch of points. Let's say that it has like 5 points, and those points are based on how recent it has been published to, how many likes it has, and it might also be looking at something else, right? Like, are there no words? Does it break any kind of like terms of service? Or does it have something extra special to it, right? Like maybe if it has a picture, we give it another point. So maybe this is 1 point, 1 point, 1 point, 1 point, and 1 point, and we get 5 points. Another post, it might have 8 points. Another post, it might have 3 points. And basically, the AI order creates a feed that organizes based on those numbers of points. And this is how it all works. But there's another problem, right? You might actually run out of your friends' content. Your friends, you might not have that many of them. I'm not going to judge. And so what do you do at that point? Well, if we look back at our timeline, there's something else that we can add here, right? We can add like news. Somewhere around 2015. News feeds. Everybody wants a piece of the action. Everybody wants those eyeballs. Everybody wants that attention. And so that's the other thing that gets big here. And I think personally that once the news and the advertising and the other companies kind of got into this timeline, it just made Facebook and every other social media just a little bit worse. Okay. I think that's about enough for now. But it isn't. I want to summarize with a couple more tools here. Let's add some tools based on my notes. So let's do it. Let's do it. This is going to be fun here. I'm going to try to characterize all of the different social medias, but before I do that, let's say that we have a bunch of different scales. We'll have friends versus frenemies. Right? This is a scale. So I'm going to put a big arrow here. Then we have centralized versus distributed. And actually, that reminds me of something that I should have added to this timeline. What's happening now, ever since about 2020, is that we actually have these walled gardens. And so here, I would call this era the rise of medium groups. Let's not say that. Let's say the rise of small groups, small big groups. Now, I'll say that these small big groups, they're basically things like Discord, small WhatsApp groups, and these can be anywhere from, say, 20 people to 300 people. And it's kind of like that balkanization discussion that we had before, where you might have all of Discord, and then all of Discord sort of has all of these little islands inside of it. And these little islands represent different kinds of groups. I'm a part of some of these groups that are based on software development, efforts, open source software type things, or AI type things. You might have one for like your school. You might have one for like a chess club. You might have one for all of these different things. And so this represents a kind of a moving direction into something that is more distributed. So this is like an example here, right? So I would say Discord is much more distributed. So you have centralized versus distributed. Another access that we can have here is anonymous. We'll say anon versus real ID. And for example, on Facebook, you're not allowed to have an ID that isn't your like actual name. And then we also have niche versus say general public. And what do I mean by that? Well, a niche thing is something that only a few people kind of like, whereas the general public is something that's made for mass media. So niche would be something like a noir film, or maybe like a kung fu movie, and the general public would be like a Marvel movie, something made to have lots of people use it. So I'm going to try to find just a list of the popular current media, and we will rate that. This looks like a pretty good list here from Wikipedia. This is list of social platforms with at least 100 million active users. So maybe we'll look at it this way here. We could look at Facebook, YouTube, WhatsApp, Instagram, TikTok, WeChat, Messenger, Telegram, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Douyin. I haven't heard of this one, and it has 700 million people in it. Weibo, I have heard of that one. Pinterest, QQ. This is from Tencent, who also does TikTok. We have X, formerly known as Twitter. Well, it started much earlier than I thought it did. Reddit, Quora, Threads. There's so many of these. Teams. I don't think I'd count Teams, but there it is. Baidu, Viber. So let's instead of doing what I was going to say, let's look at some things here, right? Which of these has the best friends? Which of these has the best friends? From the ones that I'm familiar with, actually Pinterest. So I'm going to write down Pinterest here for friends. How am I going to do this here? Sure. Let's just say Pinterest. So Pinterest, they win the friends. Now let's look at the next one. What has the most frenemies? Well, I think X has the most frenemies. Why does X have the most frenemies? It's because you can at anybody on X. You can like at Donald Trump, you can at Hillary Clinton, you can at anybody and try to start a fight, and people do start fights. So for frenemies here, I'm going to say X wins. Maybe I'll just kind of go like this. X, which is really just Twitter. Okay, next up here, we have what is the most centralized? What is the most centralized? What is the most centralized? And so centralized versus distributed is like if we think back to Tim Berners-Lee, this idea of everybody has their own sort of box that they can play in. That is what this is about. I think that actually the most centralized thing is actually I think it's actually YouTube. I think it's YouTube more than Facebook. Why do I think that? Well, there is not really anything as big as YouTube, and if YouTube makes up a new rule, it basically just goes. That's why. Okay, next up here, what is the most distributed? Among all of these, I think it's probably, I don't see it on here. I think it's called the Fediverse and maybe Mastodon. I don't really see it here. But basically, in terms of being distributed, I don't know. I think maybe Telegram, because Telegram has encryption in a way where people can't really break it. A lot of people use it who kind of want to stay sort of hidden, I guess. So let's go ahead and write down Telegram. Okay. What is the most anonymous thing? Maybe it's actually Telegram. I don't see it on here, and I don't know how many users it is, but there's an anonymous thing that's popular on the internet. That is, let's say it's Tumblr. Tumblr has a lot of anonymity in it. There's a lot of posts on there. You don't have to use your real name. And based on the just the clientele, we're going to say Tumblr. So Tumblr. This is like a microblogging platform. It's kind of similar to like a long post on Twitter. It's got hashtags, all of that. Then if we look at real ID, it's got to be LinkedIn, right? Which is right here, LinkedIn. Now, what is the most niche? This is kind of like, it's not even a good concept because, I don't know. I actually think that probably it's Discord. I would say Discord among these is the most niche that I'm familiar with. And then what's the most for the general public? It's got to be Facebook. Facebook has the most people. It's made of the most different things. That's it. Okay, so in review, we have friends versus frenemies, we have centralized versus distributed, we have anonymous versus real ID, and these are some of the social networks that I think kind of typify that. But you could take these tools and analyze them however you want to. We also went through a big timeline here that tied Facebook to other things, and boy, it doesn't look beautiful, but if you went through it with me, I think you kind of understand based on how I wrote this. To summarize, we had the wall, we had reverse chronological feeds that kind of combined those things together. There was a like button that got invented. Then we had AI ordering. After that, once it got really popular, we had too much information, and we had to use that AI ordering to manage that. Then we had things like news and other posts, and then finally, this thing that gets way too big, it's kind of broken up into these archipelagos, these little islands of, we'll call them small big groups. just so we don't have to use the word medium again in a weird way. And now we have now. We also talked about a bunch of different concepts. We talked about these philosophical ideas, including phenomenology, which is basically like explains that your feed just kind of happens to you. It's like the stream of consciousness. We talked about why you even need the feed to begin with. We talked about the beginning of Twitter and how hashtags were used by scientists. I think all of this is just really super interesting, so I hope that you've enjoyed this. In terms of homework, we're just going to be working on HTML using our thumb drive. So bring them to class. If you have some progress to see, that would be great. For the younger students who are doing hypertext cards, hopefully you've had a chance to work with the person that you're creating a game with. If not, no big deal. We basically have till the rest of the semester to work on these. So we might do an in-person workshop a week after this Thursday with some of the older kids at the library. Okay, I hope you've had a great week. I will see you next time, where we will be talking about the dangers of the internet, of which there are many. So stay safe out there. Bye.